Hubris is a Greek word that means dangerously overconfident. Based on my research, hubris fairly describes our current response to the issue of climate change.
Oh boy, here we go.
Here's what many people believe. 1. The planet is warming catastrophically because of certain human behaviors. 2. Thanks to powerful computers, we can project what the climate will be like 20, 40, or even 100 years from now. And 3. That if we eliminate just one behavior, the burning of fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels are a major cause, but nobody says they're the only cause, and no environmentalist will tell you that's the only thing that needs to change.
We can prevent the climate from changing for as long as we like. Each of these presumptions, together the basis of our hubris regarding the changing climate, is either untrue or so far off the mark as to be useless. Yes, it's true that the globe is warming, and that humans are exerting a warming influence upon it.
Wait, so they do believe in man-made climate change?
But beyond that, to paraphrase a line from the classic movie The Princess Bride,
don't you dare bring the Princess Bride into this.
I do not think the science says what you think it says. For example, government reports state clearly that heat waves in the U.S. are now no more common than they were in 1900.
Just a few seconds of Googling, and I found this. And if you want to go more in depth, Google Scholar exists.
Hurricane activity is no different than it was a century ago. Floods have...
Speaking of Google Scholar, this was the first result. You can disprove this by doing the smallest amount of research. There have been, quote, a recent upswing in frequency and intensity of Atlantic tropical cyclones. See also Webster et al. 2005, which is another paper observing the same effect.
Not increased across the globe over more than 70 years. Greenland's ice sheet isn't shrinking any more rapidly today than it was 80 years ago.
Even if that's true, you still admit that it's shrinking. According to data collected 2001 to 2021, it's losing about 277 gigatons of ice per year. But yeah, don't worry about it, I guess. It's fine.
Why aren't these reassuring facts better known?
Because they aren't true.
Because the public gets its climate information almost exclusively from the media. And from a media perspective, fear sells.
People shouldn't be afraid of climate change. They should be afraid of people saying happy holidays. They're gonna kill Christmas.
Things aren't that bad doesn't sell. Very few people, and that includes journalists who report on climate news, read the actual science. I have. And what the data, the hard science, from the U.S. government and the UN climate reports say is that things aren't that bad. Nor does the public understand the questionable basis of all catastrophic climate change projections, computer modeling. Projecting future climate is excruciatingly difficult. Yes, there are human influences, but the climate is complex. Anyone who says that climate models are just physics either doesn't understand them or is being deliberately misleading.
I can't imagine being deliberately misleading. Anyway, who funds PragerU again? Oh.
I should know. I wrote one of the first textbooks on computer modeling. While modelers base their assumptions upon both fundamental physical laws and observations of the climate, there's still considerable judgment involved. And since different modelers will make different assumptions, results vary widely among different models.
The consensus of the scientific community is still that the climate is changing and that something should be done about it.
Let's just take one simple but significant assumption modelers must make: the impact of clouds on the climate. Natural fluctuations in the height and coverage of clouds have at least as much of an impact on the flows of sunlight and heat as do human influences.
It's interesting that they bring up clouds. The fact that clouds have an impact on human influence is actually a problem because of human influences.
But how can we possibly know global cloud coverage, say, 10, let alone 50 years from now? Obviously, we can't. But to create a climate model, we have to make assumptions. That's a pretty shaky foundation on which to transform the world's economy.
What about the data scientists have been collecting for decades and the multiple peer-reviewed studies? Is that still a shaky foundation?
And by the way, creating more accurate models isn't getting any easier. In fact, the more we learn about the climate system, the more we realize how complex it is. Rather than admit this complexity, the media, the politicians, and a good portion of the climate science community
Oh, so the scientists are in on some sort of conspiracy. Well, I mean, obviously, why else would they be saying things you don't like?
attribute every terrible storm, every flood, every major fire to climate change. Yes, we've always had these weather events in the past, the narrative goes, but somehow climate change is making everything worse. Even if that were true, isn't the relevant question how much worse? Not to mention that worse is not exactly a scientific term.
Which is why scientific media tends to use terms like more intense or increased. Worse is still pretty accurate, though.
And how would we make it better? For the alarmists, that's easy. We get rid of fossil fuels. Not only is this impractical, we get over 80% of the world's energy from fossil fuels.
Which is why they have to be phased out, which is something that we probably should have started well before this point. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Obviously, nobody is expecting this to happen overnight.
It's not scientifically possible. That's because CO2 doesn't disappear from the atmosphere in a few days like, say, smog. It hangs around for a really long time.
That doesn't mean you keep adding more. You don't look at a fire and go, that's not getting better for a while, I might as well add more fuel to it.
About 60% of any CO2 that we emit today will remain in the atmosphere 20 years from now.
That's a pretty good reason to try and emit less.
Between 30 and 55% will still be there after a century, and between 15 and 30% will remain after 1,000 years. In other words, it takes centuries for the excess carbon dioxide to vanish from the atmosphere.
So why wouldn't we want to add as little as possible?
And so any partial reduction in carbon dioxide emissions would only slow the increase in human influences.
Simply slowing the effects wouldn't be ideal, but it's better than nothing.
Not prevent it, let alone reverse it.
We can't reverse the effects of this fire, so we might as well not put it out.
CO2 is not a knob that we can just turn down to fix everything.
Nobody ever claimed it was.
We don't have that ability. To think that we do is, well, hubris.
Yeah, how dare you think the world can be better?
Hubris leads to bad decisions. A little humility and a little knowledge would lead to better ones. I'm Steve Koonin, former Undersecretary for Science in the Obama administration and author of Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters.
Funny he brings up his book. He cites it for a good portion of the video. In fact, he quotes it word for word.
Blah blah blah, please give us money.